My name is Delaney Moheski. I'm based in Boston, Massachusetts. I'm a neurologic music therapist and I work for a company called MedRhythms. We're a team of neurologic music therapy clinicians who we are based at the Spalding Rehab Hospital, the main rehab hospital here in Boston, and we also see patients in the outpatient and the in-home setting and deliver neurologic music therapy services to them. So we'll be talking about today how music affects our brain and why it's a great tool for therapy. So I'm just going to jump right on in because I always like to ask the group if anyone is a musician, whether that means you've at one time played an instrument, you sang in a choir, or maybe you picked one up for a little bit. Really, even if you played one more than 5 years ago, I'd love to hear if anyone in our group today has. All right. Well, then I kind of like to go on and say, can we agree that music has power in some way? We can move right along, but I like to have a moment where you can just reflect on how you do use music every day, whether it's when you take a ride somewhere and the radio's playing, or you, like me, you do some kind of movement for exercise and you put music on to motivate you and keep you going. And sometimes we don't realize how much we're influenced by it at an everyday level and how much it influences our routine. And so I hope today you can kind of be a little inspired to use music in your everyday life in some way, and maybe it'll help you if you're continuing your recovery journey in some way to be a little inspired to use music in that capacity as well. Has anybody heard of music therapy before? Head nods. I will also take head nods. And a thumbs up. I like it. Has anybody heard of neurologic music therapy? Music therapy began in a social science model, really targeting people's well being, their everyday psychosocial skills and feelings, and translated into a neuroscience model following neuroimaging studies and having the ability to see how our brain is impacted by music and being able to see it through these neuroimaging studies and getting the data. So from that research, we were able to say, how can this translate into clinical practice that can help people with neurologic injury and disease? And that began uh, the birth of neurologic music therapy. And I'll show you some of our interventions today, and I'll show you some examples of what we do in the therapy setting. But I basically use music as my tool to address cognition goals, movement goals, and speech and language goals that individuals may have. And everything we do is research and evidence-based, looking at how does our brain perceive and produce music, and what is that non-music carryover. So as a clinician, I want to see that carryover into a non-musical function. I may be using music as my tool, and we may be engaging in music in the therapy process, but it's because we want to see a carryover that's no longer musical, that will continue to bring you through your everyday life. And we'll see some examples, like I said, as we move forward. And so moving right along, that uh, ability to see the brain through neuroimaging data under the influence of music led us to believe that there isn't just one area in our brain that processes music. We don't have a music center. So that's a myth that's been, what is it when they do Mythbusters and they they bust the myths? That's what I always think when I think there's not one music center in our brain that processes music. We actually have four areas in our brain that process music, and at the cortical and subcortical level, so our frontal lobe, temporal lobe, the basal ganglia, and our cerebellum. And we know from research that music uh, activates areas, like I said, that also activate cognition, like our attention and our memory skills, as well as our language and our movement, because there's shared and overlapped networks in our brain. I can't wait to show you this next video. We're all born with the ability to perceive rhythm, and there isn't really a different part of the brain in musicians. There's actually just more there. So those networks in the brain that a musician might use to play their instrument or read the sheet music, and whatever skills are required for that, is just a little more thicker in a musician brain. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have the ability to, while you're engaging in music, whether you are trying to practice to become a high star musician, change those areas of the brain. That's what we know from the research is their areas are just bigger and thicker because they've been doing it more, they're engaging in more. Because of that, anyone who engages in music at a therapeutic level for a X amount of time will have that effect on their brain. It's because of the repetition of being under the influence of any task, and what will move into just the neuroplasticity that music has in our brain. So more into this, because music activates all these areas in our brain, we also know that music activates both sides of our brain, our right and our left hemispheres. So that way it can compensate for itself a lot better following injury, following disease within a therapy process. And you can think of the same thing with musicians. They're still under the influence of music. They're engaging in it often, and so their brain is also changing over time, also changing shape, also going through neuroplasticity. They'll look different, of course, but there is still that structural change. So like when we think about therapy and engaging in a therapy task, it's always person-based, and how long they do it and the amount of effort that's put into it, the motivation behind it. And that's kind of the same thing I mean when musicians learn their instrument. You can't sit down every day for 2 minutes and fiddle around and expect to see amazing progress over time, just like you can't expect to do your therapy homework once a week and never look at it the other 6 days and see long-term effects. So I'm going to just move forward and show you a really cool video that I like to show. And it's important to know that the most really clinically relevant element of music as a clinician is the rhythm. And let me just show you this video that you've probably seen, maybe, because it went viral for a little bit.
Oh man, this is hilarious.
So what we're seeing here is called entrainment or rhythmic entrainment, and it's obviously something that we're born with. And it's like what we see when you listen to your favorite song and you start to clap along, or you can dance to the music and tap your foot in time. And it's the ability of rhythm, or that music, that steady beat, to prime and get your motor system ready to move. So there's a direct access from the music we listen to the motor areas in our brain that will lead to an improvement of motor output, which if we don't have any questions, I'm going to just move forward and show you an example of that clinically. So today, I guess before I show you that video, I'll just briefly talk about the areas that we'll look at today. We won't have time to go through every single one, but I'll show you the treatment areas that I work through as a neurologic music therapist in the sensory motor, speech and language, and cognition domains. And even if you see something on the screen today that I don't talk about, feel free to ask me a question about it at the end. But let me just move on. And we're going to start with an intervention that I use as a neurologic music therapist for gait training or walking. And so rhythmic auditory stimulation is used to help someone learn or relearn to walk again. And what I do as a clinician, whether I'm working with a physical therapist in the clinic or just me and the client, is I would first watch the individual walk, look at their baseline, and then what I do with the music, whether I increase the tempo or slow down the tempo, is dependent on the individual's walking goals. So I'm going to show you an example of rhythmic auditory stimulation in this video clip because that's the best way for you to understand what I'm talking about. And so this is a good example of what I mean by rhythmic entrainment. So let me make the screen big for us.
Smiling. I'm almost done.
Yeah, almost here, you know, but that's okay.
Yeah.
So just to refresh, what you saw was one physical therapy and neurologic music therapy co-treat session. You could see that the music was able to speed the man up and increase his distance, as well as other gait parameters, other parts of his walking and his walking pattern were enhanced as well. Does anyone have any questions or comments? All right, I'm going to move right along. So the next movement intervention I'll share with you all today is called therapeutic instrumental music performance. And this is when we use instruments to target different movement patterns. So kind of like the picture you see, because musical instruments give us that auditory feedback. So as a clinician, if I know the type of exercise or the type of movement that someone is practicing or working on or even trying to strengthen, I can place the instruments, spatially configure them in a way that'll make a therapeutic pattern so that they're doing that correct movement that they need to practice therapeutically, but it looks like they're playing instruments. And the auditory feedback, when put in the right spots, is telling that an individual's brain, okay, I'm doing the movement right, because it's getting that consistent feedback. It's listening to the music that's just telling the brain when and how to move. So I'm going to go into our next domain of speech and language. So we're going to talk a little bit about music for speech and language today, and we'll start with the intervention melodic intonation therapy. And this is used with individuals who have expressive aphasia, because music is a great tool for expressive language. And that's because research has been able to show us over time that when individuals lose their ability to speak, they still are able to sing. And this is because music accesses the part of the brain that is not damaged, that language centered on the right hemisphere, when there's damage in the left hemisphere, because of music's ability to activate both parts of our brain. And melodic intonation therapy uses the rhythm and the melody of music to structure functional phrases. So I'll show you an example of what this looks like in the clinical setting.
Try it again. I'm Peter. I'm Peter. I'm Peter. How are you? How are you? Hello, I'm Peter. How are you? I am good. Thank you. How are you? You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when times are gray.
Great. And Peter underwent a pretty intensive form of neurologic music therapy. So that before and after was over 6 months, and he was seen twice a week for an hour by his clinician, just to give you a little bit of context there. So I'm going to move on to another intervention we use for speech and language, and this musical speech stimulation targets automatic and spontaneous speech. And automatics are all around us, so not up but down, not in, not out. And so we can use music and overlearned songs, overlearned melodies and chants to target and reinforce spontaneous speech and spontaneous sounds. So we're going to do an example today, if you're brave to put yourself off of mute and sing along with me, if you know the Beatles, which I'm sure you do. And so our example today is a patient who is trying to work on the sound, the B sound for his name, Bob, so ba. And in our scenario, it's difficult for him to initiate, but it's also important for him to learn because he wants to be able to introduce his name, Bob. And so because we know that Bob is a Beatles fan, Beatles music is probably considered overlearned and familiar music to him. And so we can use a song to target and reinforce that sound that we're trying to learn and teach. So when I stop singing, that's when you, if you would like to sing along, will fill in the target word. So this is an example of musical speech stimulation for automatic speech. Here we go. When I find myself in times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be She is standing right in front of me, speaking words of wisdom. Let it be. So I'll sing this part. Let it be. Let it be. Oh, very nice. Whoever joined me there, thank you. So that would be an example of getting out automatic and spontaneous speech. Very nice. Okay, so I'm going to move into cognition, but before I do, I also like to, I don't have a slide on it today, as there are so many things that I would talk about if I talked about everything. But one intervention that we work on in the speech language voice domain is called oral motor and respiratory exercises, and it uses music and rhythm to strengthen and improve our respiratory system and our articulatory system, so all the muscles of the mouth and the lips and the tongue. And an example of using music to strengthen our respiratory system is, someone mentioned at the beginning, playing a harmonica, because playing a harmonica gives you the ability to breathe in and out, so you can structure different breathing patterns through the harmonica, and you'll get that auditory feedback telling your brain that you did the breathing pattern correctly, because you'll hear the sound going in and out. And an example of if you were to use music to strengthen the muscles of your articulatory system is maybe Let It Be, for an example. The rhythm and the melody will drive the intervention. So if you could put a simple vowel sound or syllable sound, like B, for example, over and over, and just sing it on the melody, B, 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 B. Same thing with if you were targeting another type of sound, like trying to even strengthen the lips, alternating between ooh and ee, ooh ee, ooh ee, ooh ee. And the music will provide that repetition, so you have many trials to work on those muscles and eventually strengthen it over time. And the music has that motivating element as well, that we've all talked about and have mentioned, as well as that feedback that you'll get from hearing the sound and knowing that you did it correctly. So does anyone have any questions before I keep going? Okay, awesome. I like how I can take silence as a no. So I'm going to just go ahead and jump into our last domain that I'll share with you all today, and that would be cognition. So why music for cognition? What we know is rhythm is an organizer, and we can use music to focus and contain our attention. I think we kind of talked about this at the beginning. When you put on background music, it's easier to complete a task. And when another example is when people are trying to learn information or study new material, sometimes it's really helpful for them to have music on to help them focus their attention on what they need to do. We also know that music engages multiple areas of our brain, so we have that maximal functional output and are able to target different areas of cognition. And it can be used across the spectrum with a variety of individuals. Anybody will benefit from engaging in music, and we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. So I'll just talk about two different interventions: attention and memory. How can we use music to target and strengthen both? And one of those musical attention control training is an intervention we use to target all levels of attention. So what you see here: sustained attention, selective attention, focused, alternating, dividing attention as well, and even your ability to concentrate. Music can be used to bring timing and organization and grouping so that it's a little bit easier for you to sustain your attention, like I said earlier. So I'm going to do just a quick example with you all. This one you can stay on mute for. And what you'll do is I'm going to sing a song, and when you hear my target word, which is the word sun, I'll just have you raise your hand for me. Right? So when you hear the word sun, here comes the sun, here comes the sun, and I said, it's alright, very nice. Little darling, it's been a long, cold, lonely winter. Here comes the sun. Here you go. Here comes the moon. Oh, I got some of you. Oh. And I said, it's alright. Alright, very nice. So in that task, because you all were so great at it, I had to make it a little bit harder because you were anticipating the target word, the word that I was asking you to select amongst a bunch of other words. So if we were continuing to do that task, I'd probably try to find a song that was really unfamiliar and ask you to listen to a variety of target words to really challenge your attention. But very nice job. All right, so the last thing I'll share with you all today is called musical mnemonics training. And musical mnemonics are all around us, such as the best part of waking up is. Maybe another example of a musical mnemonic is ba-da-ba-ba-ba, I'm loving it. So these companies are very smart to use mnemonics as their way of marketing, because you'll always think of their product when you hear that tune or melody. But we use mnemonics in a way that's more relevant to the individual, whoever I'm working with as a clinician. So whether that's trying to remember their everyday routine, trying to remember past events in their life, maybe a grocery list. In the hospital setting, we use mnemonics as a way for orientation, so where you are, why you're here, and what the month is, etc. But musical mnemonics are used because the repetition and the melody and the rhythm are eventually going to strengthen in your long-term memory over time. So the more you listen to these tunes, these musical mnemonics, like all of these marketing ones that you hear every day on the radio, it's going to embed into your long-term memory over time. So that's an example of how music influences our memory system. So that is my presentation for you all. Just some takeaways is, as a clinician, I use music for movement, speech and language, and cognition. Music can aid in neuroplasticity, so our brain can shape and form in new ways when we engage in music, because our brain is bilaterally activated by music. We know that rhythm primes our motor system, so it's ready to move, and melody can be applied for helping with speech rehab, and that music captures our attention and can be great for cognition. A lot of us said we were musicians or have engaged in music, and just playing a musical instrument is great for cognition. So if especially higher order thinking, like our executive functioning skills, and some instruments are really easy to get a hold of and can be easy to start to learn, whether it's a simple ukulele. And playing an instrument requires a lot of different cognition skills, like your divided attention to read sheet music, the ability to sequence, all kinds of different things. So that would be a great way of using music in the home for cognition as well. So if anyone has any thoughts for me or questions, I'd be happy to have that discussion. I am doing this at home. Absolutely email me that you can use music on your own to engage yourself or work on any recovery goals that you might have. So you can email us, or you can visit our website that I have on the screen, and where we get to know you find out what your goals are for yourself, see if you're appropriate for our services.